The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. This is our Get Back Your Coffee Break webinar. My name is Karen Arriviaga and I am the Sales Development Representative here at Qualtrics. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're very excited to have Brenda Jackson from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Food and Drug Protection Division here with us today. They're going to give us an inside look on how they're currently managing their compliance initiatives and also saving significant time with their audit preparation. So before I hand it off to Brenda, a couple of housekeeping things. We would like to encourage you to please feel free to ask questions throughout her presentation. There's actually a questions area located in the GoToWebinar application, and so you can just type them in there. Towards the end of the webinar, if we have time before our 30 minutes is up, we'll go ahead and talk about those questions and share them with the group. But if we run out of time, we will answer those questions through email and get back to you. So without further ado, I am going to hand this over to Brenda. I'm going to make you the presenter, Brenda.
Okay.
And I can see your screen.
Wonderful. All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Karen, for that nice introduction. What I'd like to do in our time today is explain how, over the course of a couple years, we were able to implement Qualtrics and improve our audit readiness and, I think, our audit results. We implemented Qualtrics in 2014 after an external assessment and gave ourselves approximately a year to be fully implemented and one more year to develop our records, and had another assessment earlier this year in 2016. So today I'm going to share with you some of the tremendous differences that we found having Qualtrics in place as opposed to our previous system. Before I jump into that, I'd like to give you just a brief overview of who we are as it relates to Qualtrics, audits, and accreditation. We are a state government lab. We have about 55 employees all on site in a variety of lab sections. We are privileged to have a group of 4 QA people, and those are the folks that manage Qualtrics for us. You can see on your screen a list of the different types of samples that we test. We are accredited for every one of those lab sections that you see on the screen. We've been accredited since 2010 to ISO 17025, and we currently have about 70 methods on our scope. Plus, we have a flexible or technology-based scope in our pesticide residue section. Back in 2010, when we started this process, we had about 300 documents, a couple hundred worksheets, in addition some logbooks that we controlled. And as most labs who are starting out, we had a very manual document control process. We had a lot of forms that had to be filled out by hand to manage document control. We also used some Access databases that were varying levels of complexity. In our lab, we do not have computer workstations at every bench in the lab, so we have to maintain a system of providing hard copies, and that distribution, of course, has to be controlled to remain in compliance with 17025. We ended up with a total of about 8 individual Access databases. They were not linked together. We had a tremendous number of paper records, and we were fortunate in that our administrative assistant at the time had some Access and Visual Basic programming skills, which was not a requirement of that position. We frankly just got a little bit lucky, but it did mean that it was a potential weakness, because if that person left, we couldn't require those skills in their replacement. Despite all of this, we had successful accreditation assessments for several years. Our initial experiences, however, in preparing for those assessments showed us that the preparation was a very time-consuming and tedious process. Our audit preparation began about 3 months before the assessment, and I think many of you are familiar with all of the records that you feel you have to look through to be prepared. So, for example, we looked at annual document reviews to make sure they were completed and that we hadn't skipped anything. We needed to make sure that we had records, that the appropriate staff had received and read a document revision. Had to make sure our internal audits were all gathered and our nonconformities and the various other records that you see listed there. And what we realized was preparing for an audit didn't mean that we could look at document reviews one time. It tended to be an ongoing chore. We would identify gaps, we would have handwritten lists of where the gaps were, and somebody would have to go back and follow up. And so it wasn't a one-time task to spend a couple of days and look at any particular record and check off and say we were good. It was really an ongoing chore that took the entire QA staff about 3 months to prepare for an audit. And we said to ourselves, there has to be a better way to do this. So we began looking for a sustainable, computer-based, complete quality management system. And we knew we wanted to be able to administer this without requiring programming expertise. Sure enough, in the middle of this process, that administrative assistant that I mentioned earlier did in fact leave, and we weren't able to replace them with anybody that had the same level of programming skills. In addition, many labs make great records and lots of them. The weakness that we found was in retrieving those records, and that is never more apparent to you than during the middle of an external assessment when now somebody is asking in a very short time period for lots and lots of records. And we realized we needed to streamline this process and gain some efficiencies. So if I were to summarize, I like this little graphic because it shows where I think a lot of labs start is with a manual system, and then the natural progression is you begin working with technology, and then eventually, hopefully, we evolve to making the technology work for us, and that's where the streamlining and the gaining efficiencies comes in. So let's think about a typical external audit approach, and I'm sure some of you have experienced something like this, whether it's 17025 or any other quality standard. In 17025, we have the two different clauses, the management clause and the technical clause. Within the management clause, in a typical audit, you have to show that you're complying with the requirements of document control. An assessor may look at management review, which can lead into a variety of things, such as complaints and feedback, internal audits, various action items. Your internal audits themselves are a very complex set of records, and you often have to link those to other actions, such as corrective actions or preventive actions. That's a sample of everything one has to prepare in the management system section of the standard. But even in the technical section, the QA group may still have responsibilities for training records, which are never easy to manage, equipment records or equipment master lists. Sometimes QA will coordinate the calibration or verification of things like masses and pipettes and balances, and that can be a great number of items they have to keep up with. Somehow you have to have a good handle on your proficiency tests and all those reports. And then, of course, even if the laboratory is managing data packets and reports, the assessors can go back a little bit in time, so you have to show that you can in fact retrieve those records. So the key here is that all of these records on the screen and others that aren't listed have to be readily available during an audit, and that's where we found we were struggling. So once we implemented Qualtrics, we found that there were a variety of ways we could make the system improve our record retrieval audit. Now, I mentioned earlier that we wanted to look at a complete quality management system, not just a document control system, but document control can be considered to be the heart of any quality management system. So let's start there. And if we only implemented the document control module in Qualtrics, we found that we could meet several requirements in ISO section 4.3. I've listed several of these here, and I've included the specific subclause in parentheses. So you can see that the approvals, which are automatically tracked by the system, and a master list, which is automatically generated, can meet clause 4.3.2.1. We make sure through the system that only approved versions are available, which meets 4.3.2.2. If you have a system that requires distribution of hard copies, you can make the Qualtrics system work for you using either a workflow or a custom field, and I'll talk about what those mean later on very briefly. Furthermore, you can ensure that document review, whether you do that annually or on some other, is triggered by the system, and the reports are very easy to generate. So whoever is responsible for reviewing certain documents can run their own report and see how they're progressing. Historical versions are kept by the system, so just with one screen you can see that half of Clause 4.3 can be met with a pre-existing module. In addition, Qualtrics offers some testing features that we chose to use, and those help us to track the acknowledgement of staff that they have in fact received and read a document revision or a new document, and we can ensure that those are automatically sent to the relevant groups instead of having to try to manage that manually. Now that covers just what's available in the particular Qualtrics module, but there are other things that one can do to help ensure compliance beyond Section 4.3. In Qualtrics, you can establish a custom field, which could be a list, or it could be a text field, or it could be a field where you upload something, and you can establish document dependencies, which really are just links between documents, and those things can also support your compliance to a quality standard. Let me give you a couple of examples. For our accreditation, our accrediting body requires us to identify the category of measurement uncertainty. That's a really easy thing to forget to do, and that's very sad to have a deficiency about that during an audit because it is such an easy thing to do. So we established a custom field, which is simply a list of these different categories, and we made it mandatory so that for any technical SOP, it is required that we fill out that field. Now we don't have to remember. We also established a document dependency, or a link, to the particular measurement uncertainty record, so we can always go back and find that very easily. Another example is a deviation report. Section 5.4.1 requires that if you deviate from an established method, you have to document it, technically justify it, and obtain customer approval. That leads to a record. And it's very easy to misplace those records, not remember which method has a deviation report, and so on. In Qualtrics, we established these document dependencies, or links, to link our deviation report record to the particular technical SOP. There are many other ways that I can imagine one could use some of the features of a quality management system like Qualtrics to help with compliance. Some of those could include some other custom fields. For example, if you do distribute documents, you could use a text or a drop-down field to document who received a hard copy. Often we need to keep a list of proficiency test providers and the frequency of those proficiency tests, so one could use a custom field perhaps to document that. Training requirements typically don't change for a particular SOP, and one could define those in a custom field. And I'm sure there are many other ways that you could use custom fields or these dependencies or linkages to help support your compliance beyond merely the 4.3 requirements. Now, I talked about wanting to be able to retrieve records. That was a very important aspect to us. And in Qualtrics, we've found two great ways to retrieve records quickly and easily. One is a reports field, which is simply a pre-created report that you can run, and the other is advanced search, which works like any search feature, and that's maybe a one-time search that you want to do, and you can very much custom tailor it to the search that you're conducting at that point. So I'd like to share with you 3 specific examples of how we might use reports or advanced search to come up with some results quickly for an assessor. Before I jump into that, let me give you just a couple sentences about workflows if you're not familiar with them. A workflow in Qualtrics is sort of like an automated form. So you have the various fields in this workflow process are the same as the fields on a form, and you can route it to whoever needs to approve it, which is the same as handing your piece of paper to whoever needs to sign it. And all of that can be pre-established within Qualtrics with no programming skills necessary, and you can capture all the information that you normally would on a paper form through this automated workflow process. We've created several of these. One is what we call a general training workflow. And all you need to know about that is we use this for one-time trainings. These are not your ongoing trainings that you know you're always going to have. These might be specific to one circumstance, and they may not even be directly related to 17025. Our record for these trainings is generally a training roster, which is simply a list of all the attendees' signatures. If you use a workflow and you attach a record to it, then you can perform a search on it. And you can search based on any number of fields, for example, dates or affected personnel. And one of the things that we found was our assessor earlier this year said, show me your ethics training record. I was able to perform a quick search, and part of the result that I got back is shown on the screen here. This inbox display field is simply the title of your workflow instance. And down at the bottom of this screen you see 2015 Ethics Organic section. That's simply the time that we conducted an ethics training in our organic section, and there's a roster attached. What's not shown is a hyperlink to that particular workflow instance, so I could click on the hyperlink and pull up my records of having conducted that training. Let's look at another instance. This has to do with proficiency tests. We perform proficiency tests throughout our lab. With 70 methods on our scope, you can imagine we have a lot of proficiency test reports to keep up with. So we created this workflow to help us keep track of these reports. Again, when the assessor says, let's look at your proficiency tests, show me a list, I'm able to search based on lab section or a date range and come up with the results that you see here. The column on the right that says inbox display field is the title of that proficiency test. Now the phrases that you see don't mean anything to you, but to me that tells me exactly what proficiency test I'm looking at. Once I've identified that, I can click on the hyperlink on the left, the blue numbers that you see, and that takes me right to that proficiency test instance, and I can look at who performed the test and what instrument and what our report was. So I could find those very, very quickly for the assessor. The third example I wanted to show you has to do with internal audits. Now, I think we all know that internal audits can become very, very complicated and messy records. We're required to audit not just the clauses of 17025, we also have to audit our own quality SOPs and our own testing activities. You can perform audits covering all of those in one audit activity, which can make for some complicated records. If you create a workflow or an automated process in Qualtrics, you can attach the relevant SOPs, you may have checklists, you may have other supporting objective evidence, whether it's photographs or interview notes or so forth. You can attach all of that in one internal audit workflow. You can also think about how you name that particular audit instance in your workflow, and then you can run a report when you're sitting with the assessor and have to prove that you in fact met your schedule. What I'm showing here is a sample of a report, and you can see again on the left the inbox display field. This tells me an awful lot about the audit. It gives me the last name of the person who performed the audit. It tells me the ISO clause number the audit was related to. In the first case, that's clause 4.1. It tells me the SOP that I was auditing, and it tells me what area I was looking at. So that inbox display field is a very powerful tool to help me show that I in fact did comply with my schedule. If we need to look at any particular records from that audit, we can look in the left-hand column under ID, and that blue number is a hyperlink. So I can go to that particular audit and I can see all of my records, and I can see who performed the audit and all the details that I might need to show an assessor. There's one more feature that we have found over the years that's very important. Can you link your audit findings to corrective or preventive actions? And you very quickly realize that trying to remember is not going to be a very effective system. You need some kind of code or some kind of link to tie those activities together. One thing one could do is to simply use the Qualtrics ID number. So the ID number of the audit could be included in your corrective action, and that could link those together, and you could search on that. There's also a way in Qualtrics that you can link various activities or workflows together. So you could have an internal audit workflow and it could launch a corrective action workflow process if you needed to. So you can keep those activities linked together, and that could work for any number of activities that you wanted to link together. So we implemented all of this in Qualtrics, hoping that we would come up with our ideal external audit. I'm sure everybody has a slightly different idea of what that means. To me, an ideal external audit means that all of our records can be found very quickly, and we can filter the records to show only what is asked for. So not only can we sort out what we're not interested in, we're only showing those records we might be interested in sharing with an assessor. We have activities that need to be linked, readily linked, so we can easily get from one to the other. For example, I can get from an internal audit to any resulting corrective or preventive actions. Our records, particularly those stemming from workflows, include dates, responsible parties, supporting attachments, all that extra information that you need to be able to provide. And one thing that we found in our 2016 audit, I hadn't really expected, but I think it's of tremendous value, though it's intangible, and that is the positive tone that you set during your assessment. Our auditors actually said that they were very impressed with how quickly we could retrieve our records. Our QA staff is able to remain calm, which again goes towards that positive tone, and we were able to complete our quality management system audit in 3.5 hours. It normally takes 8. So we saved a great deal of time. The other benefit of that is that our auditors were able to focus on the technical in the laboratory, and they had time to more thoroughly evaluate what was going on in the laboratory, which can lead to greater opportunity for improvements in your operations. Whether you find deficiencies or not, you can get a great deal of excellent information from an assessor that will improve your operations, and that, after all, is the real value of an audit. So what I'd like to do now is kind of bring this all together. This slide and the next slide, I hope, will do that. They'll be a little bit confusing by the time I'm done, but if we take it stepwise, I think it will make sense to everybody. What you see on the left of this slide is simply a list of all the subclauses of ISO 17025 Clause 4 management requirements. What you see in the middle is a screenshot of our particular file structure, and what you see on the right is a subfolder and its supporting file structure. So what I'd like to do is show you now how we were able to use all of the records held in various places in Qualtrics to meet the different subclauses of 17025. If we start with subclause 4.1, organization, we can see that we had some documents filed in our quality management system or QMS folder, and we also had a folder if we had any undue pressure reports or conflict of interest reports where we could hold those. The management system, of course, is described in documents. Our document control records are the Qualtrics document control module. For clause 4.4, review of requests, tenders, and contracts, we actually have a documented contract with our customers, which we keep in a customer contracts folder. Our lab does not subcontract any tests, so I'll move on to 4.6, purchasing, services, and supplies. That can result in a lot of documents and records, such as an approved supplier list, which we can keep in a purchasing folder so that everybody knows where that will be held. One of the ways that we provide service to the customer is through having regular meetings with our customer, and those meeting minutes are stored in a folder in Qualtrics. Complaints, of course, are reviewed at management review. Several of the necessary records we manage through a workflow, and you've seen some of those workflow search results. Control of records is actually demonstrated by the Qualtrics system as well as the laboratory and how we're able to find those records. I've mentioned that our internal audits are managed through a workflow, and we've looked at a search result that would help us get to those particular records. And management review generates several documents and records, and we keep those in a particular folder for management review. So the red arrows lead us from the particular clauses to where I have every one of those records, and I can cover all 15 clauses of Section 4 using Qualtrics. I can do something similar with Clause 5, the technical requirements. Now, many of these are held by the lab, but our quality assurance group keeps several of these records as well. If we start with the personnel or training, we manage to use the training module in Qualtrics to help us track a great deal of those. The accommodation and environmental conditions can lead to some environmental testing, and we can keep those in a folder in Qualtrics for easy retrieval. 5.4 test methods and method validation has several components. We keep detection limits, deviation reports, measurement uncertainty determinations, as well as method verifications and validations, all in separate folders in Qualtrics, and those can be linked to their appropriate SOPs. Equipment is primarily managed by our laboratory, but in the traceability and calibration clause, in our case, our quality assurance group manages a lot of the calibrations of our reference standards and our pipettes, so we can keep all of those records, including the certificates, in a folder in Qualtrics. Our particular lab does not perform any sampling, but if we look at handling of calibration and test items, there's a component in that standard where one needs to communicate with the customer if a sample arrives in a condition where you're not certain it's appropriate to be tested. We have a workflow that helps us track that. Assuring the quality of test and calibration results and reporting is largely handled by the lab or our LIMS system. But you can see that those aspects of Clause 5 that QA manages can all be handled by the Qualtrics system. So to sum this up, it's important to think big, and by that I mean you want a complete quality management system, not just document control. I hear a lot of people talk about wanting a document control system, but you have a lot more records than just those required by 4.3, and it's very helpful to think big. There are many processes that you would want to be able to tie together. That's very helpful to do, particularly in an external audit or for your own uses, and you can do that with an electronic system. The information retrieval is much more efficient when you have all of this stored in an electronic system as opposed to separate systems and paper records. You've got a couple different tools that you can use to get those records back, and it's very quick and easy to pull those records. All of this leads into making a more efficient system, which will meet your business needs better. It limits the number of resources you have to dedicate because the record retrieval is so fast, and it certainly helps with both internal and external assessments. So with that, I will thank everybody for their attention and open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brenda. I'm going to go ahead and steal a screen back from you real fast. Give me 1 second. We do have a couple of questions that are coming in. Just to also let everyone know, we are recording this session, and so if you would like to review it again, or if you happen to miss a little bit of the beginning, we'll be sending out that recording later on this week when we get it posted. Or if you would like to share it with your quality teams, feel free to do that as well. All right, Brenda. So one of the first questions I have is, how do you know that your hard copies of the documents are current?
We created a workflow, which again is sort of an automated form. And when you do that, you can put in all kinds of little questions to remind yourself of things. So for example, if somebody requests a hard copy, they have to do it through a workflow. And one of the questions that we in QA have to ask ourselves is, did they return the old copy? It prompts us to go look, which is a simple report. We look and see if they have returned the old copy, and if they haven't, they don't get the new one before they turn in the old one, ever. So a workflow can really help you. You can very much custom tailor the questions you ask and who you ask the questions of.
Wonderful. All right. Another question we have, and this actually might be a question more for the Qualtrics side, is how do I get a demo of the Qualtrics software and how this all works? Definitely we can help you out there. We actually do webinars every other week, and we also can offer private demos of the system. We'll be happy to give you a tour and show you how we can put all of this stuff into Qualtrics and give you a tour of the system. If there's any other questions, feel free to put those in that questions area, and we will be happy to address those. Brenda, on behalf of myself, our Kayla and the Qualtrics team and everybody on the webinar today, thank you so very much for this presentation. It was wonderful, and I know we've all learned a great deal from watching you, so thank you very much.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I don't see any other questions. I do have one more question, and we're at 2:30, but we'll go ahead and ask it anyways. The question is, does the system provide track changes for each record created by a user? Who, when, what was created or changed?
You do get routing information. For example, on a workflow, I can see when it went from one step to the next and who moved it forward. At this point, with the revision that we are on, if someone changes if they have write access and change a record, I do not have a specific audit trail on that. But what you can do is you can limit by role who has write access to various fields in a record. So for example, if I have a form and it has 2 sections and I'm responsible for section 1 and I fill it out and I send it to another person and they're responsible for section 2, I can adjust the settings so that they can see what I typed but can't change it.
Great. And also, I think I'm going to invite Kayla on, who's also a part of our sales team. Kayla, are you there?
I am, thank you. I just wanted to also mention that track changes, as a lot of people know, as you see within a product like Word, that is something that is a request that our current customers have made of Qualtrics, and it is something that is in the works right now. It's actually in development, and we anticipate that being released in one of our future releases of the software. I believe it's slotted for the end of this year or beginning of next. So the track changes, with the colors and all of the line items, like you would see in a Microsoft Word type of a product, that is something we are looking to implement as well.
Wonderful. All right, well, we've now gone over by 2 minutes. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. We had a big crowd, so thank you very much for sitting in on our webinar. If you have any additional questions or would like to see a demo, please feel free to reach out to myself or Kayla. We'd be happy to get that set up for you. Or if you have questions for Brenda, feel free to send them our way and we can get those to her as well. Again, Brenda, thank you so very much. Everyone, I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.